lot of words for a little bitty person, I know. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear the microphone? Good. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is, and I get to the end of it where I actually talk about science, but what I'm going to talk about is policy and regulatory developments that impact our ability to develop food standards or global food standards, which is really at the end. But the reason that I think this is important, not only from my perspective and the work that I do, because food policy is actually what I spend the majority of my time on, but also as we look at a global food supply, we're starting to see an incursion of politics into policy, and we think we see it here in the US, but when you start talking about global standards or global food supply or global trade in food and ingredients, it's really an issue that we have that's increasingly problematic for us, but also very important to you as scientists who will come forward to work in the industry or in government or even in academia to teach people about the scientific basis of decision making, which is really important in the end for us to be able to trade fairly and to have a food supply that's not only safe but also secure. So what I'm going to talk about today is the regulators and what their roles are, as well as some regulations, mostly in the US, but I'll bring in some global aspects to that as well. I'm going to talk about the US regulatory agencies very briefly, only to separate out who's responsible for what and why that's really important to us now. I'm going to talk about the US regulatory environment, global regulatory considerations, and then risk and science-based regulation. And one of the things that I'll talk about as I talk about risk-based and science-based is the answer that we in the industry have historically given to those who would ask questions or detract from what it is or where it is that we're coming from, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. So the regulations that are, or the legislation that's listed here, are the regulations that have sort of impacted over the last 100+ years of food trade in the US in a variety of different areas, the first being the Pure Food Act. I'm going to talk about several of these individually, but the Pure Food Act I'll come to very specifically because it was the cornerstone of what we started with when USDA was actually in charge of food many, many years ago. So if you start with the Food Act and you go to the end there, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011, it's all about prevention. And when we talk about prevention and we talk about quality control and we talk about food safety and security, this model is very different from the model that we started with in 1906 or in the early 1900s, and there's probably a reason for that. So the first, the Pure Food Act, Food and Drug Act, as I said, administered by USDA, later switched to FDA, and that's an important piece too. This was really about economic adulteration. Those of you who are in your meat science classes have had to read The Jungle, or you may have read it in high school or whatever. It was about adding stuff to food that didn't belong there for the purposes of selling it for a higher price. The most recent one that we have heard about, that we don't even hear about that very much in this country anymore, but the one that we heard about last year was the addition of a nitrogen-containing compound to dry milk, powdered milk, infant formula for the purposes of coming up with the appropriate, quote, protein number in those products to be able to sell the product as milk when in fact it wasn't milk. So it was a nitrogen-containing something, had a detection method that gave you a conversion from nitrogen to protein, and as a consequence increased the value regardless of the fact that in fact there was not in fact protein there. So the issue with the initial food acts were really about economic adulteration. It was really about putting something in there that didn't belong there and in essence shamming you as the consumer. So it was consumer protection, but not in the way that we see consumer protection today. So amendments to the act, which ended up in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938, a number of amendments came to be part of this because of the fact that as the food trade continued, as commerce continued in the US, identified issues in increasingly food safety started to happen in various segments of the industry. So animal drugs, vitamins and minerals, infant formulas, interstate sale, nutrition labeling and education is one that you probably are very familiar with, and for me, in 1990. I was pretty far in my career when that happened. But I remember it happening, and I remember the impact that it had on the industry, and I'll come back and talk about that. And then Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. We never had any kind of rules or regulations for the sales of dietary supplements. So we had dietary supplements proliferating, and from a consumer perspective, that might have been a very positive thing. From an industry perspective, it was certainly a growing industry, but we didn't have any kind of boundaries for what that meant. And as a consequence, there was a lot of trade in compounds that probably shouldn't have been traded as dietary supplements. But in addition to that, we also had FDA saying that dietary supplements were foods, so they were regulating them as foods. And what Congress said is no. These are different, they have very specific purposes, and when it comes to their sale, regulation, and labeling, they're different. So FDA didn't have as much control over these as they had, and as a consequence, the dietary supplement industry actually has flourished as a consequence of that. And then the Food Allergen Labeling and Protection Act that I'm sure all of you are aware of too. So as we moved from what I would call the economic adulteration, the tricking consumers, to food safety, we've moved from what was the Pure Food Act to now what we're looking at in terms of international trade and the consequences of that on what the industry can say and what the government is required to do as a consequence of those changes. So when we talked before, and the example I used here is cement in your milk, there was cement that was mixed into powdered milk. There was literally dry cement, and it was purchased that way. There was blood that was put in sausages, and it was sold that way. And it was for the purposes of creating a product that cost less to produce, but consumers continued to pay for. It's just the reality of the food system. And if you think about it from a home perspective, we don't wish to think about this in industry, but at home, if you don't have quite enough sour cream to put in something, you might add some yogurt, or you might add some milk, and you might add something else, and you'd say, I followed the recipe. In fact, you didn't follow the recipe, you did something different. And typically we do it to make it a little less expensive. So we don't use all of the fill-in-the-blank ingredient that's more expensive. Similarly, the food industry, when it wasn't regulated, human nature did it themselves. So as a consequence of that, we have increasing regulation, and we had food adulteration on purpose and not on purpose. And as a consequence of that, we increased the amount of regulation we had on not only ingredients in foods, but how they were sold, how they were labeled, what we were able to communicate about them. Think about the recent prohibition of marketing some foods to children. Why would that be something that the US government should be doing? Why would that be something that our policy and legislative groups should be having any kind of influence on at all? But they do. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit in the future. So what we're talking about in terms of key regulatory agencies then are Food and Drug Administration under the Department of Health and Human Services. Somebody was mentioning earlier today the Centers for Disease Control as part of that as well. Public health. So their mandate is pretty much public health and safety. But as you know, we now have within the last 2 years a Commissioner of Foods, which is a very different role than the role that FDA has played historically. So when I was saying about the new act that is associated with food safety and modernization in 2011, it's about prevention. So the regulators that are the regulations that are coming into place, the implementation guidelines for those, all of that is about prevention. It's not about doing anything after the fact. It's instead of letting you have it happen in the industry, preventing it from happening as a consequence of the way that you're regulated. Very different model than the food industry has had historically, very different model than the US government has had in the past. And what's interesting about this one, and meaningful, is that Congress mandated that through legislation. Congress said this is the way the Food and Drug Administration is going to act. This is the way the food industry will be policed. And as a consequence, that requirement of FDA to do more meant that all the other things that they were doing, labeling, dietary supplements, food additives, all of those things, got in the mix with this new preventative controls piece, and there's no more money to do it. So FDA is struggling with the work that they had historically, no more people, no more money, and in fact, if we get what we wish for in a week from now, no more money at all, fewer people, less money, and all of that. So the problem that we have here is that we have now a very, very obvious example of politics being included in or introduced into food industry regulation that is to the detriment of not only the food industry but also to the government, because they can't do what it is that they're forced to be doing. Department of Commerce has oversight on fish and fisheries, Consumer Safety Product Commission, toys, that kind of thing. FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, that's the one that's coming after industry for claims that they are saying are not true. FDA has the responsibility to be sure that what you put on your label is true. When you don't do it and it's a claim, FTC can come after you for that. So the Palm Wonderful is the better example of any of that now. Palm Wonderful, I don't know if all of y'all are familiar with the ads that they had, but they were all over the metro in Washington, D.C., huge signs, pictures of hearts and the wonders of Palm Wonderful on heart and this and that and the other thing. Well, they were taken to court and in fact lost. They appealed, also lost. Federal Trade Commission came after them for false, misleading, not true claims about their products. Typically a role that FDA might have had, but FTC with marketing now has it. And then the Environmental Protection Agency. Increasingly, the Environmental Protection Agency is taking a role in food regulation, food law, because of what's left after you produce a food. So if you think about producing an enzyme, for example. You have a fermentation bath, you have these microbes that get together and produce these enzymes, you extract the enzymes, and then you have this stuff that's left. That stuff has to go somewhere. Historically, it went down the drain. Increasingly, it's being used as some sort of a fertilizer or whatever for fields. And when it is, Environmental Protection Agency gets in the mix and starts asking questions about what is the bioload, what's actually in that stuff, what's the safety of it, what's the impact, environmental impact, et cetera. Increasingly involved. So when we talk about what is the role of regulators, regulators don't set policy, but they act to enforce policy, which means that they can do it in a number of different ways. And we were talking earlier today, just a little while ago, with some regulators about what their roles are and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. The reality is there are requirements of our regulators to do things that we may or may not wish them to do. There are regulations that we may or may not agree with, but the reality is we as industry are supposed to follow them. And typically, at least in this country, they have been scientifically based. So the new discussion about the GSFI and all the regulations and from farm to fork, which people really actually do mean now, the links in the value chain of the food system are starting to mandate that people in fact pay attention to each one of the links. But not only that, follow rules so that in their piece of the value chain or their piece, their link, that they are in fact doing what is supposed to be being done to meet the regulation. So it's a little more complicated than it's been. It's definitely linked where it hasn't been before. Farmer grew it, sold it, that was the end of it for him. It's no longer the case. The other piece and this is really kind of the cornerstone of the message that I have, is the increased move for transparency. A lot of young people in the audience, and you are very familiar with the word transparency, but also it means something to you. And to me, what it means is I want to know. And as a consequence of me wanting to know, that means I need to tell you. So if you want to know, I need to tell you. How do I tell you? How do I tell you what it is that you want to know? So in terms of transparency, President Obama in his second year came up with a transparency for the administration decree. The administration will act in a transparent manner. We can argue they have or they haven't, it doesn't really matter. The reality is he's on record as saying, we're going to do our work in a transparent manner. You're going to see it, you can ask questions, you'll get those answered, et cetera. Recently, and this is really important for when we look at the role of the European Food Safety Authority, what we know is that the science is separated from the regulation in Europe. The member states have come together and they have a food safety authority, and that food safety authority is off doing its food science thing. It's doing its safety assessment of a number of things, and then it comes out with, yep, it is, no, it's not. And they talk about what that means. They've historically been cloistered in their place by themselves, doing their thing, writing their judgments, and then giving them to the commission. And the commission would then come out with a regulation or legislate something. In essence, it would become the guidance or the law or whatever it was. Recently, as early as January of this year, EFSA came out with a statement that they are going to increase their transparency. They're going to open up the process by which they do their safety assessments and evaluations for public scrutiny. What that means, it means a lot of different things, but what it means from a science perspective is that the science that they've been looking at, and most of us would agree with it, has been a really good scientific basis for the decisions that they've been making or the outcomes that they've been reporting. They don't make the decisions, they review the science. But now what we're going to do is get to be able to see who are their scientists, what is the science that they're looking at, what does it mean, what are we missing in case we come out with a different conclusion, and also recognizing that in the case of a product that goes through their process and it's found to be, quote, safe, or there aren't found to be any kind of issues with it, it goes to the commission and the commission denies it. On what basis is the commission denying it? And it's about something else other than science. So the benefit to us as consumers, the benefit to European consumers, and the whole science basis of risk and regulation is that there will be now an understanding of, here comes this outcome from this risk assessment or these series of risk assessments, these people that we know who they are. The decision is made not to take that for whatever reason, and we then grow to understand what that means. And what it means is that somebody's made the decision not to accept a scientific basis of an assessment and to do something else. The something else is related, in the case of Europe, to what they're terming the precautionary principle. We don't know, so we don't want it. We don't know, so we've got more questions to ask. We don't know, so we want to wait. We don't know, so we want to review it again. And that's a problem, and it's a huge problem as it relates to global trade, because you never know when the question's going to come up. You don't know what the question's going to be, and you don't know how to address it. So now we'll know this is the outcome of the scientific assessment, and we'll be able to look at it. In the US, this is now coming under fire as it relates to what's called the generally recognized as SAFE program, or the GRASS program. Historically in the US, when you had a food additive or a food ingredient, you had to go through a regulatory process for a safety assessment. And it took typically 10 years. We've got stuff in the pipeline that's been there for 25 years. But 10 years, 5 years, 7 years if you were really lucky, but typically about average was 10 years. So a new food additive, a new food ingredient that has a function, and we'll come back to those in just a second, had to go through this process, couldn't be used until such time as FDA said it's, quote, safe. What they said was, you know, in some cases, this is silly. In some cases, it doesn't make any sense at all for us to have to re-review a substance that has been used in a number of different ways, perhaps not in this application. It doesn't make sense for us to spend regulatory dollars that are limited, people time that is limited, resources that we don't have, on a system when in fact the industry is not going to use it if it's not safe. If there's not a scientific basis for it, yeah, we need to review it. But if there is, prove it. You prove it and then you're responsible for it. So the generally recognized as safe program was intended to be, you demonstrate through history of use and general recognition of safety. General recognition of safety, what does that mean? It means that anybody in this room who has a scientific background of any kind would open the same literature and find the same thing that you found if it is in fact generally recognized. Anybody could open the books, anybody could read the articles, anybody could make the determination that this thing is in fact safe. General recognition. And then history of use. So history of use being, has this ever been in the food supply before? And you might say, yeah, it's been used in, you know, borage has some of this. And everybody goes, what's borage? Well, borage was in a publication in 1922, and it had this compound in it at this level. So then, as you know, you go through the calculations to demonstrate how much is in this compound, how much are you exposed to, how many times a day do you eat it, what's average, normal, whatever. And you make the scientific case. You present the dossier. You have an expert panel to review it. You either hire an expert panel or you do it yourselves internally as industry, and we'll have that conversation too. But you hire a third-party organization to do your expert panel. They come out with something that says, yep, based on what we've seen, this is safe to use at this level. And you can either tell FDA or not tell FDA. The problem with this is you're sitting there as perhaps a naysayer or somebody who has questions is, wait a minute, the industry's going to use selected data. The industry's going to have itself review it. The industry's going to make a decision that's in its best financial interest, and they're going to put out a product that's not safe. Okay, you could reach that conclusion maybe. But in the end, what FDA says and what we all know is industry's responsible for what it puts on the shelf. We're not going to sell, a food company is not going to sell an ingredient that's not safe, knowingly sell a product that's not safe. Theoretically, or hopefully, or they would, have reviewed the data, have reviewed the exposure, have calculated what it is, and come up with generally recognized as safe. What's happened associated with this in the last 3 years is that the Pew Charitable Trust has come together with a group of others to start looking at the regulatory system in general, the US regulatory system in general. And what they're saying is, we're not sure. So we're not sure because, and there's a wonderful article that they've published. I don't have the reference for it, but if anybody wants it, let me know and I'll give it to you. Or I'll give it to Chuck or somebody. Anyway, wonderful article about the US regulatory system and what's wrong with it from their perspective. The what's wrong with it, you can argue one way or the other. We like it, we don't like it, we see an issue, we don't see an issue. But what they've done is highlight points in the US regulatory system that give them pause, that you need to look at. The problem with that is that if you look at that and say for any given ingredient or any given food or any given technology, this is a question that you have, it's very different from saying, we don't trust the whole food regulatory system, which is in essence what this says. There are questions about the food regulatory system in the US that give us reason to think that, conclude that the food system isn't safe and we need regulatory reform. Data don't support that, but that's the conclusion that they've come up with. And in the case of grass system, what they're saying in this article, I think the number's 58,000 compounds that are present in the US food supply that haven't been reviewed by FDA. Okay, what does that really mean? Well, then we look at our public health status, we look at our, microbial issues, which is what we normally look at. We look at shelf stability, we look at flavor, we look at all those kinds of things, and we say, we don't really have an issue in terms of safety, but we don't know. And because we don't know, and because of the society that we're currently living in, we're asking questions that there aren't answers for. And what Pew and others are starting to say is then we need to regulate it. If we regulate it, the costs of that regulation without a known benefit are great. The costs are great. We already know our regulators don't have enough money to do what they need to be doing now. So it creates a conundrum for us. So in terms of food science, food production, we use food additives, we use food ingredients for a reason. We develop new technology, production and processing methods, and I just went through your meat science labs and some of the food technology that's being used there to produce food is scientifically valid. There have been data developed to demonstrate that these systems work or they wouldn't be used by the food industry. But we as consumers, we as a population, we as a US group are starting to say, don't fiddle with my food. I want you to leave my food alone. I want to buy food whole out of your backyard. I want to know what's in it. I don't want this discussion about food additives, but it's unrealistic. Most of us who want to buy strawberries in February or January or December can't buy them fresh from anywhere in the US. They don't exist. So we're using food technology or food science, food ingredients, food safety mechanisms in order to be able to prolong the shelf life. in order to be able to destroy microbes that might otherwise be there, in order to enhance the flavor, enhance the quality, add nutrients, whatever it is. But what's happening on the other side, and it's really the pull that we're having in our society right now, is we don't want the food industry to fiddle with our food. We don't want the ingredient label to say what it says. We want 3 ingredients, or we want Haagen-Dazs's 5 ingredients, or we want 1 ingredient, we want to buy it fresh. And it's unrealistic given what we have to produce in this country. So the technologies I've listed here, the ones at the top you know well, but in terms of nutritional, the nutritional component of this, what we know, those of us who are older than those of you who aren't so old, is that we started with food enrichment in the 1940s. And the purpose of fortification. We started fortification. No, we started enrichment in the 1940s as a consequence of overproducing the white in white flour. So we're buying white flour, and we're buying white bread, and we're buying white rice, and we're buying white this and that and the other thing. And when we did, the production processes that were used removed much of the nutrient that was there. So the B vitamins and calcium gone. As a consequence, we started enriching those products back to the level that they were historically. That's the first indication that we have of that, bless you. So as we start to look at the food enrichment moves to food fortification, moves to nutritional attributes, again, we as a society started saying we want this, we don't want that, because we're starting to be concerned not only about nutritional quality as it relates to, we're all okay, versus we want to be better. And the we want to be better part of this is a story that coalesces with that of the Dietary Supplementation Act as well. So we want to start taking other stuff. We don't want to just eat food as food, because what we want is this food that's better. But we also want food that doesn't have any ingredients added to it and that it's not processed, but we want it to be better than it is. So it's a conundrum, it's a problem, and as a consequence of that, what we're doing, we're making unilateral pronouncements about what we will and will have in our food supply, what we want and we don't want, and we are, in essence, jerking the food industry around. So the one story that I would tell you about is the zero trans fat story, which is an interesting one from an industry perspective, because the way that you get trans fat, you all know from your food science classes, is hydrogenation. You can get natural through rumination, fermentation in the gut of cattle, so you have natural dairy trans fats. But the ones that we produce in industry, trans fatty acids are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And the reason that you have trans fat is because we don't want soybean oil, we want margarine. And we don't want cookies that melt all over the plate, we want cookies that stay together. We want foods that don't exist in nature, and as a consequence of that, we have to do something to what does exist in nature to make it happen. So we change oil to a fat, and when we do, we produce trans fats. But before we did that, we used tropical oils. So we used coconut oil, and we used palm oil, and we used palm kernel oil, and we used all those kinds of things that are what? High in saturated fats. Well, we don't want those. So we have somebody who goes on a campaign and puts full-page ads in the New York Times talking about tropical oils. So Nabisco, General Foods, and their brothers all shift from tropical oils to hydrogenated oils to produce the fat that the saturated fats produced naturally. So on your label would be coconut oil, and you go, yay, coconut oil. Oops, nope. High in saturated fat, can't have it. Okay, soybean oil. Yeah, but soybean oil doesn't work, so it has to be hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. Oops, nope, it produces trans fats. What we did in the industry is develop the data package that demonstrated the horrors of the health effects of trans fatty acids on human health. And as a consequence, we've had to go back to something else. Guess what we're going back to? Tropical oils. So we're forgetting saturated fatty acids that we all spent all of our time in school learning about. We're ducking zero trans fat now, and we're back to tropical oils. So when you read on the label coconut oil or palm oil or any of those, they're tropical oils. They're higher in saturated fatty acids. Well, guess what else has happened? We quit talking about saturated fatty acids. Remember? We went from saturated fatty acids, terrible, animal, awful, we should all be vegetarians, to cholesterol, oh no, don't eat eggs, to, well, maybe not. How about hydrogenated fatty acids? And I mean, so all of it is the food industry going back and forth in relation to certainly what the public health industries or public health community is telling us. But in addition to that, what medical science is telling us and the dietary guidelines. If you go back to 1980 and read the USDA, DHHS dietary guidelines starting in 1980, and you read through what's happened, it's gone just like this. Do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that. The reality is we all need to be eating a sensible diet. They added food safety to that in 1995, I think, was the first year food safety was part of the dietary guidelines. And I remember saying to myself, what is food safety doing in the dietary guidelines? What does it have to do with dietary guidance? Well, 20 years later, we know. The food industry, the way it's moving, is all about food safety. So food safety is a practice in the home. Food safety is a practice by industry is the cornerstone of what it is that we need to be doing to sell food. So these are the issues that we have, and I put for food additives here, and I'm not sure why I put that, except I was leading from additives. What's interesting here is about the food label, what the label says, what it doesn't say, what it has to say. And my reason for being interested in that, and I'm going to give you a plug very briefly for biotech labeling. I just want to talk about that briefly because it's a good example of what it is that we're talking about. When you put something on the label, you're responsible for it. If you put no trans fat, it better have no trans fat. If you put make a claim, lowers cardiovascular disease, you better have data. And your data are not the same as somebody else's data. You can't use somebody else's. You have to develop your own data package. So if I want to say whatever it is I want to say, I have to prove it. So prove it. Always prove it. So you say something and my reaction to that is prove it. So because of this, there's been an interest in, and I'm saying here in regulatory oversight, but it's really been who's responsible for what? And what, as I said, what FDA has said all along, I think what USDA and anybody else would say, food industry is responsible for what it sells. But there is regulatory oversight, and in this country it is growing taller, or growing more. So a piece, and this was a piece of research that was done through IFIC and some others, and it's about trust in the food industry. And it comes back to the point that I was making about we don't trust, we don't believe. And what Pew is saying is we don't trust the regulatory system in the US. We have the safest food supply in the whole world, but never mind, we don't trust that it's okay. And I'm not arguing for or against the US food supply, I'm just saying let's look at the data. Here we have the data that show us, here's the question. You can always ask questions. I have 1,000 questions in my mind at any time. Really good to ask those questions, particularly you guys who are here at a university. Really good to be asking those questions because when you ask a question and you decide to do a research project on it, you have a hypothesis. I think that, or this isn't, whatever it is, but there is a rationale for asking the question that makes it worthy of a study. And unfortunately, we're not always doing that. So because we don't do that, we don't trust the food industry. And these are pieces of information from a study that, as I said, was published, excuse me, in December last year in IFT's publication, Food Technology. So when we have these kinds of questions from consumers or from others in other countries, we react in a certain way. Trans fats, I told you, sodium, gluten. Who's gluten sensitive? Nobody. I mean, there's certainly less than 3% of the population, and everything's gluten-free. I don't want gluten-free. I want it to contain gluten because I like gluten, because I like bread the way it is. I don't want it gluten-free. I don't want flourless chocolate cake. If you do, great, go buy it, but we shouldn't move wholesale as an industry to gluten-free. In the same way as sodium and sugar, we know instinctively when we're eating too much, fill in the blank. We know it. We may not like it. We may want to blame somebody else, but the reality is we know it. It's too sweet. I'm eating too much candy. We know that. We do that for a different reason. We're choosing to continue to do it for a different reason. The food industry can't fix that. The government really probably can't fix it either. It's all about what we do ourselves. But we react. So the latest and greatest is allergens and thresholds. We had an Food Allergen Labeling and Protection Act about 5 or 6 years ago, and the major food allergens are listed and how you have to label and what you have to say and what foods have to be labeled. It's all there. So in the case of the business that I'm with, we had a product that's soy lecithin. So most of you know what soy lecithin is. It's used as a food ingredient or a food additive for a very specific purpose, which is emulsification or stabilizer, keeping an oil and a fat together. It works very well. Used broadly in the industry. And historically, you would say lecithin. Well, now what FDA is saying is on the ingredient label, you would have to say soy lecithin. Well, guess what? I don't want to put soy lecithin on my label because it's an allergen and soy allergic people won't buy it. But the other reality of that is there is no protein in soy lecithin. There is no protein in soy lecithin or sunflower lecithin or canola lecithin. It's not there because of the process that's used. So 6 years ago, we petitioned FDA to not have to put soy on the label because those people who are avoiding soy wouldn't buy a product that contains soy lecithin as a processing aid. They have not been able to come up with an answer to whether or not this is true, regardless of the fact that we came to threshold labels, exposure levels, demonstrated in clinical trials what was a problem, what wasn't a problem with soy allergic people. And recently they came out with a request for comments on development of thresholds. Thresholds being those levels below which you wouldn't have to label. They had an expert panel on this 3 years ago. Their expert panel came up with advice that they chose not to take, so now we're having public comment. Most of us need help understanding what the public is going to give us that's going to be different from what scientists have said about what thresholds could be. But we have transparent government. So we have to have public meetings, and we have to have public comment, and we have to consider 250,000 comments. We have to respond to each one individually, and we have to make a decision. Well, FDA doesn't want to make a decision about thresholds. They don't want to make a decision about many of the things they have to make decisions about, but they're having to do it because we're forcing them to. And by forcing them to, what I'm saying is, if you create a rule, I'm going to follow it. I want to check the box because it's easier than me having to think about it. So you tell me what the rule is, I'll follow it or I won't, and I'll take the consequences. I'll be responsible for it. And that's a problem with thresholds that we have right now. So what this is leading into is that most of the regulation that's happening now, most of the issues that we're having now in global trade, as it relates to agreement about what is and what isn't, is about consumer perception. It's about a groundswell of what do I believe, what don't I believe, what do I want, what I don't want, what I don't want. Edelman and others have done a number of studies that are demonstrating what it is that consumers are saying they want in the food supply and they're not getting it. But the issue that we have as an industry is that, and I'm saying industry broadly because I'm talking about food ingredients, I'm talking about technology providers, I'm talking about all manner of, quote, industry as it relates to food, so production, whatever. Problem we have is that when consumers or media or somebody, let's say outside the scientific community, asks a question, what we say is not always believable to them. So what they ask and what we say is the same, and it's a problem. The industry continues to say, no matter what the question is, it's safe. So you asked me a question, why do you use red dye number 3? And my first answer to you is it's safe. That's not what you asked. You asked, why do I use it? You didn't ask, what is the scientific basis upon which I figured out it was safe so that you feel good about it? You said, why do you use it? What are you really asking? Because the questions that are being asked of the food industry aren't being answered. And the answers that the food industry has given have been pat. It's the same answer all the time. We've studied it, we know, we have the data, it's safe, don't you know? No, because there's a lack of trust in something in the system that's not working. It's government, it's big business, it's big industry, it's all of that that's leading consumers in a direction that is not working in our food supply. Not working here, and it's not working globally either. So another, in their Food to Fork survey, the 3 key areas where their expectations could increase trust: understanding what's in your portfolio. What is it you're selling? Transparency and shared value. The shared value is a piece that we have not done. And the shared value piece is, I'm concerned about your family and what it's eating. I'm concerned about the planet. I'm concerned about environmental protection and climate control. I'm interested in the same thing as a person, as an industry, as you are. And sharing that value means that then somehow we can build up a trust. It's really hard when you're a multi-billion-dollar company to have shared anything with a consumer or an consumer or a group of consumers. It's just hard to do. So what we're choosing to eat is not, unfortunately, I would say, as the president-elect of IFT, non-processed foods, foods that don't contain additives, stuff they can grow in their backyards, things that tell them that there's very little in this thing that's been done. So I want it fresh, I want it new, I want it best, I want it natural, I want it whatever it is that I want it. And I don't want what it is that you're offering me in the supermarket. I'm going to the supermarket and I'm buying the stuff, but I don't like it and I'm going to talk about it. And the talking about it is the piece that has gotten us in the industry, in the government, and I'd say in consumers as well, gotten us in trouble. And the trouble is that you guys, with your computers and iPads and iPhones and social media and blogs, bested the industry by a lot. And that is that you have a problem with something, you tell everybody you know about it. Everybody, all your friends, you put it on your Facebook page, had this bad experience, all your friends read it, they send it, it was so appalling, they send it to their friends. And you communicate in a way that those of us who have been around for too long don't understand. And as a consequence, we don't initiate a conversation that's meaningful. We go back to what we knew. Oh, it's safe. I'm not asking you if it's safe. I'm asking you, what about the food that you're producing is produced in the way that it's produced that's a problem for me? I don't want it processed. Why are you adding food additives? I don't want it distributed, you know, all over the world. Why are you? And there are scientific answers for that, but the answer is not science. The answer is, I understand what you're asking me, and I'm going to try to at least have a conversation with you, if not give you the answer, and we haven't done it. So when we talk about global trade, we're talking about politics, not just in the US. And as I said, I'm going to use an example of labeling policy in the US and genetic modification. So the labeling policy in the US came out 20 years ago, 1992, 20 years ago, saying foods derived from biotechnology are not compositionally, nutritionally, or end use different from their conventional counterparts. So I'm going to give you an ear of corn from genetically modified, I'm going to give you an ear of corn from conventional, and they're the same. Now why would FDA say that? How can you tell me they're the same when they've been, one's genetically modified and one isn't? Well, the plant is genetically modified, but the corn isn't. The plant's modified, you're modifying the plant to do something different than it did before, but what it produces is conventional, the same as the conventional product. That's just the reality, unless you genetically engineer it to do something different, like our high oleic soybean. So we genetically engineer a soybean plant to produce an oil that's higher in oleic acid. Okay, so the end product's different, so guess what? We're going to label it. But what FDA said is, compositionally they're not different. We are not going to require you to label, but if you do choose to label, we have voluntary provisions for you. And the voluntary provisions fit within our requirements for labeling generally. So what does that mean? It means that there are mandatory labeling elements, and you can't read all of these sub-things, and I apologize for that. I made it as big as I could. But food additives are listed, storage requirements, name and description, date mark, allergens, all of that is there, and it's mandatory. So when you look at a label on, you pick up 3 packages in the US, and you look at the labels, you go, all of the mandatory labeling elements are there. And they're there for a reason. They're there for allergy, they're there for adulteration, so what is supposed to be in this product in the ingredient list. They're there for shelf life, they're there for safety, They're there for packaging and storage requirements. They're there for a literal reason that relates to what FDA regulates. FDA regulates safety. It doesn't regulate composition. You decide about composition and then you make the decision about what to do about it. FDA is making sure that you follow the requirement. So these are the elements that are required. And if you look at a label, you say to yourself, what else am I supposed to put on this thing? The GM labeling one is an interesting one because it's not about science. And the organics and the other groups that came together, for example, in California, and were demanding mandatory labeling, were not talking necessarily about safety. They were talking about right to know. I have a right to know what's in my food. And my reaction to that is you absolutely do. We all do. So where are we going to put it on the label? What is it that's going to be meaningful to you about what's on this label that will help you with whatever your question is about GM labeling? And we're not sure what the question is. So I could say to you, FDA consultation, no questions, whatever, which is what we get from FDA, and you would say, you're not answering my question. We don't know, as an industry, we don't know what is the question. The food manufacturing industry does not know what the question is as a consequence because we keep answering it wrongly. We're resistant. So the food industry is resistant to a change. FDA is unwilling to make a change, and consumers continue to say we have a right to know. And so we're at an impasse, and the impasse is ending up in legislation. It's ending up in state regulations legislation that's going to be voted on. It's ending up in court cases. It's ending up in places where it doesn't belong because we don't know what we're talking about. We're talking at each other, and the conversation is not helpful. It's not helpful to anybody, and it's caused a lot of aggravation. So where would you put it? And it's hard to know. These are obviously nutrition claims that have been produced or have been approved by FDA. What you might say on something is hasn't been approved by FDA. So in terms of international food regulation, what's important here is that the U.S., as a huge agricultural country, wishes to have trade with other countries in food ingredients, food commodities in general. So we regulate increasingly, as you all know who have been associated with the industry, we increasingly regulate imported products because we're increasing global trade. When our regulations were written, they were written for us here holding hands together in the US. But now we have products coming in from other countries, and a consequence of that, we're less trustful. So that we're putting into place rules that we can check the box and everything's great. Well, that's great, except most countries want to do that as well. They want to maintain their sovereignty. And so what we developed not that long ago, 20 years ago, is the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an arbiter of what is fair practice in trade. And there are two provisions to it. One is based on phytosanitary and sanitary, sort of what we call safety. The other is freedom of trade. So I call it something and it isn't. You called it this and it wasn't that. We can't agree on what a sardine is, and I'll come to why I'm saying that in just a second. The point being that I want to trade with you, and I want to trade equitably. I want to trade fairly. So when I tell you it's a pomegranate, I want you to believe it's a pomegranate and buy it believing that. And similarly, when you sell me a pomegranate, I want it to know it's a pomegranate. So the World Trade Organization, who has these two provisions, named the Codex Alimentarius, and you'll mostly hear about it as Codex, as the foundation for standards development in food trade. So when we have a pomegranate, Codex has a standard for pomegranate. It's X big, Y this, here's the composition, here are the additives, here's the whatever it is about the pomegranate, so that when you buy it from me, if it's not what you thought it was and I don't agree to give you your money back, there would otherwise be a trade barrier, I'm going to take you to the World Food Court. So you've all heard about the beef case where the U.S. took the EU to the World Food Court about beef hormones. And won to what end? No end. They didn't pay, it was a big ruckus, big press thing. What we want is equitable fair trade. So Codex Alimentarius is one of the two organizations, the other is International Standards Organization, that develop standards, global standards for trade. And I'm going to talk briefly about Codex, principally because that's where I do the majority of my work. But it's about fair trade and consumer health and safety, consumer protection, so selling safe foods. And it's those foods that in fact have global trade that's worth having, a volume that's worth trading. 181 countries cannot agree at the beginning on anything. So these sessions last for years and years, and in fact, in the case of genetic modification labeling on products, they came to the place where the FDA is after 20 years. We met every year, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a year for 20 years to come to the place where, yep, not a safety issue, yep, they're the same. If you want to label, this is how you do it, but you're not required to. So the US could take a case against the EU, for example, for their mandatory labeling. Why would we? It's not worth it. There are 20-something countries that have mandatory labeling requirements. We choose to follow them. The trade chooses to follow them. But they're there as a barrier to trade. They're not there based on safety. So the message really is about how do we get safety elements, academic input, how do we get the science put back in the regulation or in the safety advice that we get, not only from global, not from other countries also, but our own as well. So the scientific advice for international trade, I mentioned briefly the European Commission, I'll come back to that, but the US and Canada, very large trading partners, most of our stuff is pretty much the same. Where we get our advice is different, however. European Commission I'll come back to. I talked briefly about Codex and then international standards. So each of these, and somebody was talking about, we just want one rule. We just want one rule. We want to all know what the rule is and we can decide to follow it or not, or trade or not. We just want a rule. Unfortunately, it's not happening. And harmonization is a word that you'll hear about in terms of global trade and regulation. Harmonization of standards. Harmonization of risk assessment, harmonization of risk management outcomes. So in the case of the US, we have public meetings, and if you read the Federal Register, you get any of those kinds of notices. Every single one of the international committees into which there will be input on any kind of trade in the US, there's a public meeting. And the public meeting is intended for, yes, whoever's interested lays out their issue, but the public is invited to listen to that discussion, provide input if they want to provide it, and then FDA goes back, or USDA or EPA or whoever's having the public meeting goes back and makes a decision about where they're going to be, and then they publish it. They publish a notification in the Federal Register. We all comment back. It takes them 2, 3, 4 years to review the comments, and they come back with the regulation. That's just the process. It's, quote, open and transparent. European Food Safety Authority, I already mentioned, has this group of scientists that get together. They cannot be associated in any way with industry, never have an industry grant, never spend a year sabbatical anywhere, none of that. So academic scientists, typically the people who have studied a piece of the science but don't have the application necessarily are those on that. Codex has expert committees, the Food and Ag, FAO and WHO both input that. And opportunities for positions, scientific positions, exist in these international organizations. And the place that you can have the greatest input or an impact is to be involved in those expert committees, to have the education, to develop the science, to provide input in a way that is scientifically meaningful and defensible. And unfortunately, we haven't always done that in a very good way. ISO, same thing, expert panels and committees. However, I'll tell you, in the case of ISO, it's industry-led or has been industry-led, although many countries now put government people on their delegations as well. But it's typically the guy who can afford to go to the meeting who ends up going. And so your expert can be, I was an expert on one on traceability for ISO. I knew what traceability meant. I knew what it looked like to me. I was by no means an expert. The US chose to send me and I went. And it was a good exercise, but we hadn't even defined traceability as an industry yet. That's the kind of thing you get in an organization like that, where it tends to be one country, one vote, one piece of input or not. 5 people show up to the meeting, 5 people develop an international standard, 5 people make sure that standard passes, and then we're all stuck with it. So ISO is a place where we as a government, we as an industry, we as scientists also need to be paying more attention than we have in the past. Codex is consensus-based. So our scientific impact is these, as I was saying before. Safety, not only in our country, but in other countries as well. Equivalence is something that we haven't talked about, and I've got like 4 minutes, so I'm going to stop. But equivalence of systems. So when you say you have a HACCP plan, and I say I have a HACCP plan, they may not be the same, but the hope is that they will be equivalent. Equivalent regulation, equivalent assessment across countries means bilateral trade is equivalent and fair and safe. We don't have a good track record of that in the U.S. Minimizing trade barriers, labeling and tracing being a big one, and I know traceability is something that many of you are talking about in many of the different classes that you have now. IFT is looking at traceability now as a potential center, being something for the food industry to have to create the links that the food industry needs to determine that, or to establish that the products that they're selling are in fact what they say they are, from the farm all the way until they go out the door of the grocery store. So what we have now is food safety is the issue, nutritional quality and the relative amount of that, global food availability, incongruent regulatory systems, and the move that many of us don't understand to organic, natural, or green, whatever that means. We haven't done a good job of understanding what that means, and then any environmental overlaps is an issue for us as well. So these are the areas where global trade is impacted by science. Scientists can have an impact on that by engaging, involving yourself. And what somebody said to me is, if you want to go, go. You want to be in the middle of that conversation, go. Pick up the phone and invite yourself. If you hear about something that's happening and you're interested in it and you want to be involved, pick up the phone and ask. Something that I didn't do as much in my career as I might have done, and I recommend everybody do. Stick your nose in it. If nobody wants you there, just do it anyway. And find out what it is, what it means, and how it's important, and what you can do scientifically to impact it. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you. I appreciate it.